No one expected the power to disappear that afternoon. The lake was calm, the sky bright, and Daniel Harper believed it would be another quiet day in his small lakeside home. But a single switch pulled somewhere down the road would change everything. And before the sun set, the entire neighborhood would learn a truth that no one had seen coming. Daniel lived in a peaceful community controlled by a strict homeowners association. The neighborhood looked perfect from the outside: clean lawns, polished fences, and rules that governed almost every detail. Most residents followed those rules quietly. But the HOA president, Karen Whitmore, believed the rules gave her something more than authority. She believed they gave her control. Daniel rarely argued with anyone. His focus was always inside the house, where a quiet room held the most important person in his life, his 12-year-old son, Ethan. Ethan was brave, gentle, and fighting a difficult medical condition that required special equipment to help him breathe safely. That equipment ran on electricity. Daniel had installed backup batteries and alarms, but the system depended on stable power from the neighborhood grid. Doctors had warned him to avoid sudden outages whenever possible. Karen didn't know any of that. That afternoon, she was busy driving slowly through the community, looking for rule violations. When she passed Daniel's house, she noticed something that immediately irritated her. A small medical van was parked in the driveway. To Karen, it looked like a violation waiting to happen, and she was already reaching for her phone to call maintenance when she made a decision that would soon turn the entire neighborhood upside down. Karen Whitmore believed rules were the backbone of the neighborhood. But over the years, the rules had quietly turned into something else in her mind. They had become power. She stepped out of her car, sunglasses reflecting the quiet street, and stared at Daniel's driveway. The white medical van had been parked there for hours. In her mind, it looked like a commercial vehicle, and HOA guidelines clearly stated that commercial vehicles could not remain in driveways overnight or for extended periods. She didn't knock on the door. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she called the HOA maintenance contractor and spoke with calm confidence. "House on Lakeview Drive," she said firmly. "The property is violating vehicle policy. I want the electrical access restricted until the owner addresses the issue." The contractor hesitated. Cutting power wasn't common. But Karen was the HOA president, and her tone made it clear she expected action. Within minutes, a small switch inside the neighborhood service panel was flipped. Inside Daniel's home, the lights blinked once, then everything went dark. The quiet hum of medical equipment suddenly stopped. Daniel froze in the hallway as alarms began beeping from Ethan's room. His heart dropped as he rushed inside. The backup battery system had activated, but it would only last a limited time. He grabbed his phone and stepped outside. Trying to understand what had happened, across the street, Karen watched from her car with a satisfied smile, believing she had simply enforced another rule. But she had no idea what was happening inside that house, and Daniel was about to walk straight toward her with a question that would change everything. Daniel stepped onto the driveway, his heart racing as the soft alarm from inside the house echoed faintly behind him. He looked toward the street and immediately saw Karen sitting in her car. She lowered the window slowly, already prepared for an argument. "Is there a problem?" she asked calmly. Daniel tried to keep his voice steady. "The power just went out. Do you know anything about that?" Karen folded her arms. "Your property is currently violating HOA vehicle regulations. That van has been parked there all day." Daniel blinked, confused for a moment. "That's a medical transport van. It's here for my son." Karen shook her head slightly. "The rules apply to everyone. Once the vehicle is moved and the violation addressed, the situation can be reviewed." Daniel's stomach tightened. "You turned off my power because of a van?" Karen didn't answer directly. Instead, she spoke in the calm, rehearsed tone she used during HOA meetings. "Community guidelines must be respected." Daniel looked back toward the house where Ethan's equipment was quietly running on backup batteries. Time was suddenly very important. "My son needs that electricity," he said firmly. "His medical equipment depends on it." Karen hesitated for only a second, then she shrugged slightly. "Well, you should have considered that before breaking HOA policy." For a moment, Daniel simply stared at her, realizing she truly didn't understand what she had done. Inside the house, the backup alarm changed to a slower warning tone. Daniel took a deep breath, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number, and the person who answered that call would soon bring a completely unexpected visitor to the neighborhood. Daniel stepped back inside the house as the phone rang. The sound of Ethan's breathing equipment running on backup power filled the quiet hallway. On the other end of the line, a calm voice answered, "Emergency support services. How can we help?" Daniel explained quickly. He described the sudden power outage, the HOA action, and the medical equipment his son depended on. The operator listened carefully and began documenting every detail. Within minutes, something important happened. The operator contacted the local utility company, and the utility company contacted a federal oversight department responsible for protecting access to essential medical infrastructure. Daniel didn't know that part yet. All he knew was that someone had promised help was on the way. Across the street, Karen remained in her car, scrolling through HOA reports on her tablet. To her, the situation was already finished. She believed Daniel would simply move the van and apologize, but then two vehicles slowly entered the neighborhood. The first was a utility company truck, the second was a dark government SUV that made several residents step outside their homes to watch. Karen sat up straighter as both vehicles stopped in front of Daniel's house. Two officials stepped out and began examining the neighborhood electrical access panel. One of them turned toward Karen's car. "Ma'am," he said politely. "Are you the HOA representative here?" Karen smiled confidently. "Yes. I'm the president." The man nodded once. "Then we're going to need to discuss a very serious situation." And suddenly Karen realized the afternoon wasn't going the way she expected. Neighbors began gathering quietly along the sidewalks as the officials spoke with Karen near the electrical panel. The conversation started calmly, but Karen's confident posture slowly faded. The utility supervisor explained something very clearly. "Power to this home was intentionally restricted," he said, pointing at the panel. Karen nodded. "Yes. HOA enforcement." The second official stepped forward and opened a folder. "This property has a registered medical support system," he said. "Homes with that classification are protected under federal accessibility guidelines." Karen frowned. "I'm not familiar with that rule." The official replied gently but firmly, "That's because it's not an HOA rule. It's federal law." Around them, neighbors whispered quietly. Daniel stood on the porch, watching as technicians restored the electrical connection. Moments later, lights inside the house flickered back to life. Inside Ethan's room, the equipment returned to full power. Daniel finally exhaled in relief. Meanwhile, Karen looked stunned as the officials continued explaining the situation. Disconnecting essential utilities from a medically registered home, even temporarily, triggered a mandatory investigation. "I was enforcing community guidelines," Karen insisted. The supervisor shook his head. "Those guidelines can't override medical protections." Karen's confident smile was completely gone now. And the quiet neighborhood was about to witness the moment when her authority finally collided with something much bigger. The officials finished their inspection while neighbors continued watching from their driveways. What had started as a quiet afternoon HOA dispute had become the most talked about moment the neighborhood had ever seen. One official approached Daniel and shook his hand. "Your power is fully restored," he said. "We've also placed a protected status note on the property to prevent this from happening again." Daniel thanked him quietly, relief visible on his face. Across the street, Karen stood beside her car, no longer speaking. The same confidence she had carried all afternoon had disappeared completely. The second official walked toward her with calm professionalism. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "our office will need to review the decision process that led to the disconnection." Karen tried to respond, but the situation had already shifted beyond her control. Neighbors who had once avoided HOA meetings were now watching closely. Some quietly recorded the scene on their phones. Others simply stood in disbelief. The neighborhood rules had always seemed powerful, but now everyone could see that some things mattered far more. Daniel returned inside the house and sat beside Ethan's bed, listening to the steady sound of the medical equipment running normally again. Outside, the government SUV slowly pulled away from the curb. And Karen Whitmore realized the story she thought she was controlling had turned into something entirely different. But the final twist of the day hadn't even been spoken yet. By evening, the quiet neighborhood had completely changed. What began as a simple HOA enforcement decision had revealed something far more serious about authority, responsibility, and compassion. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that night. Several residents attended for the first time in years. They had heard about the power shutdown, the officials who arrived, and the explanation about protected medical homes. Karen Whitmore sat silently at the end of the table while the board reviewed the situation. The investigation report from the utility company had already been filed. The conclusion was clear: the decision to disconnect Daniel's power had violated federal medical protection guidelines. The board members looked at each other before making a quiet but important decision. The HOA leadership would be restructured immediately to ensure something like this could never happen again. Across the neighborhood, residents checked on Daniel and Ethan, offering support and kindness that had never appeared before. Inside the Harper home, the lights glowed warmly again. Daniel sat beside Ethan, grateful for the calm returning to their lives. The story spread through the community quickly, not as gossip, but as a reminder: rules can guide a neighborhood, but empathy protects the people living in it, and that single lesson would reshape the entire community for years to come. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.